The court found that the evidence in this case was very clear, that based on the letter that was a bogus letter sent by the Department of Justice claiming that these congressional seats in Texas were unlawful because they were made up of Black and Hispanic voters. They tried this ruse that they were trying to protect Black and Hispanic voters when in fact they were intentionally discriminating. The court found that the Department of Justice letter statements made by Republicans were very clear that the intent was to use race to discriminate against Hispanics and Blacks throughout Texas. And that's ultimately what the court determined, and that violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and violates the Voting Rights Act. So it's a major victory because, again, it confirms that what we have been saying from the beginning, that these maps were discriminatory. They harm Black and Hispanic voters because the only thing it achieves is that it prevents Black and Hispanic voters from having influence. It breaks up Black and Hispanic neighborhoods to prevent them from voting together to elect a member of Congress. So I'm very glad today's decision restores my faith a little bit in democracy. At the end of the day, we still have a constitution, we still have laws, and no matter how bad Donald Trump wants 5 additional congressional seats, these things still have to go through the courts. You cannot just discriminate against millions of Hispanic and Black Texans and not expect the courts to do something about it. So I'm very glad of today's decision, and I hope that the Supreme Court will ultimately uphold this decision when it goes to the Supreme Court.
I just double check and clarify. This blocks the map that was redrawn a couple of months ago.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it blocks the map from taking effect.
And this is the 2025 map.
Yeah, that was in August. That was approved by Republicans.
Now, earlier you mentioned that this goes from here directly to the Supreme Court.
That's right.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Because this is a case under the Voting Rights Act, it's not going to go to an appeals court and then to the Supreme Court. That's why there was a 3-judge panel. 2 of them were district judges. 1 of them was from the circuit court. If this is appealed, which the state of Texas already indicated it'll go straight to the Supreme Court. And again, hopefully they come to the same conclusion because the evidence is clear and overwhelming in this case.
I'm not sure if by the time this, or right now, Trump has said any response, but I know Paxton and Abbott have made responses already. Talk to me a little about those.
Yeah, the reason why I took the extraordinary step to break quorum, to go to Chicago to fight against these maps is because I knew that when I saw them, this was incredibly harmful and discriminatory to the people of Texas, particularly those that look just like El Paso. This administration came in with a request. Donald Trump made a request that he wanted 5 additional seats, and he gave Greg Abbott a letter that was bogus from the beginning. Greg Abbott used that letter as the justification to start drawing these maps all over again. But that letter was false. There was a clear racial intent. They wanted to discriminate, and ultimately, the courts agreed with that. Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton are, they're going to appeal to this, but there's no other way to look at this. This is the most discriminatory map we have seen in our lifetimes. This is the most discriminatory map that has been passed since the 1960s. We have never seen a map this discriminatory since the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights era. That's just how bad this is. And again, I think the evidence is pretty clear cut that when this gets to the Supreme Court, I hope that they will see the same thing because it is very harmful for the people of Texas. And I'm glad that the court today agreed with that.
Today's ruling is 160 pages.
Yes.
In it, the judges stated that there's a substantial evidence of racial gerrymandering. What does this mean for Texas? Yeah,
well again, this all started because Donald Trump said he wanted 5 additional congressional seats. And he had his Department of Justice send in a letter falsely claiming that there were 5 congressional districts made up of Black and Hispanic voters that were illegal. That simply wasn't true. But it was that letter that started the whole process. Greg Abbott took that letter and used it as a justification. And then many representatives in the state house also said they have to engage in redistricting because that letter and the Department of Justice said that these districts were unconstitutional. Well, it wasn't true. That letter clearly had a racial intent. It clearly was designed to harm Black and Hispanic voters. And ultimately, the court agreed that the evidence, that letter and statements made by representatives clearly demonstrated that there was an intent to discriminate and to undermine Black and Hispanic voters, to undermine their influence in Texas. So again, the evidence was pretty clear.
And just like you said right now, the ruling does say that race played a major role in this drawing of a map. Wait for
No problem.
Real quick. What's your assessment of that part of the ruling?
The race, well, again, it's clear. As I said in my comments, when you look at the way that Republicans, well, let me say this. When you look at the map, this map gives white Texans one member of Congress for every 430,000 residents. But it gives Latinos one member of Congress for every 1.4 million Latinos. And it gives Black residents one member of Congress for every 2 million Black residents. It is grossly discriminatory and unfairly advantages white voters and gives them triple the power that they probably would under their current population. So those numbers are very important when looking at this map. And again, this map and this whole process was designed to undermine Hispanic and Black voters. It's important to remember that Hispanics make up 40% of the population. We have, on a percentage basis, more Hispanics in Texas than in California. When you combine Black Texans and Asian Texans, Hispanic, Blacks, and Asians make up 60% of the state's population. But the way that these lines are drawn is that white residents would get triple the representation. That just goes to show you how desperate Republicans are to cling to power, that they don't even want to listen or have to be accountable to Black and Hispanic voters throughout the state. That's basically what this map does. This map breeds lazy and unresponsive politicians because rather than having to go talk to voters, they just draw lines where they pick the voters who agree with them. That's basically what they do at the end of the day. It undermines democracy and undermines fairness in our democratic system.
The court is ordering the state to use the 2021 map in the 26th election. What does it mean for voters here?
Yeah, well, the good news is that this map that was drawn in August will not take effect, barring any action from the Supreme Court where they might undo this. But it's ultimately good if we go back to the maps that were drawn in 2021, that were used in 2022 and 2024. Those are at least more fair by far than what Republicans passed in this legislature in August. So ultimately, voters won't notice a difference. These districts that were affected, for example, there was one district where 95% of the voters were sent elsewhere. It's hard for us to imagine because we're geographically isolated in El Paso, but imagine if rather than having one member of Congress, well, we have two in the Far East, that they said El Paso is now going to be represented by 3. But you'll have one congressman in Lubbock, one congressman like over in Midland, and then another congressman in San Antonio, so that way El Paso doesn't come together to elect their member of Congress. That's basically what they did in Houston and Dallas and in parts of Austin to get their way and to minimize voters just like us here in El Paso from having influence. So ultimately, it's a good thing that the old maps are going to be used.
This decision has implications that could be nationwide. Especially who controls the House in 26. What are your thoughts on that?
At the end of the day, I want to keep the focus on, we can't look at this as how it's going to impact the House, which ultimately it will. But we got to keep in mind the reason why Donald Trump wanted this is because he wanted an unfair advantage to keep the House majority. He didn't care if he had to discriminate against Black and Hispanic voters to get there. But ultimately, what the courts ruled today is that the law still matters. Just because Donald Trump wants something doesn't mean that he's going to get it. We still have the Constitution. We still have laws that protect voters. And you can't disenfranchise millions of Hispanic voters and essentially wipe out their votes by spreading them out throughout the state and not giving them a fair representation. So ultimately, at the end of the day, again, this restores my faith in laws, in the Constitution, in our form of government. And I hope that this continues to be upheld at the Supreme Court.
Last question. California had an election to do something similar, but I guess in a better way, instead of just saying this is what it is, they actually went and took it to the voters.
Yeah. Look, no other state undermines Hispanic and Black voters like the state of Texas. People, I often hear, I've heard opponents say, oh, well, California and Illinois, they do the same thing. They play the same game. No way. No other state basically tries to erase Hispanic and Black populations like Texas is trying to do with this map. And what happened in California is it ultimately went to voters. They do not discriminate against any single race. They're drawing a map that basically looks at partisanship, which the Supreme Court has allowed. Here in Texas, that's not ultimately what happened. They used race as the predominant factor. Another big difference between here and California is that you have Greg Abbott, who could not get this passed to voters. If he took it to voters, it would fail. 60% of our population is Hispanic, Black, and Asian. There's no way that Texas voters would approve of a map that significantly undermines their representation. The difference is that California actually took this to voters and got voter approval. That's something that Greg Abbott would never do. I think it's indicative that Republicans are afraid. The reason why Republicans have been in power for 30 years is that they have continued to systematically do this to try to find ways to undermine Blacks and Hispanics in Texas. So, it's the one big difference is the vote that took place. The Texans here were never afforded that opportunity because Greg Abbott knows he could never get something like that passed. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't know what's going to happen in California or how this affects that. Clearly what happens in Texas affects the rest of the nation. And so California is doing something to make sure that it is not adversely affected by Texas's attempts to get an unfair advantage. But it's unfortunate that this put into play all of these things because, again, it undermines fairness in our system. I think everybody, there should be one person, one vote. Map should be fairly drawn. And that's also a big difference is that California has an independent redistricting system. Politicians in California can't do what Texas did here. And the truth of the matter is that Republican voters in California are far more protected than what Democratic voters here in Texas are. Because again, they have a system where they've taken the politics out of it.
Anything else you'd like to add? Anything else I may have forgotten to ask?
No, I think that covers it.